Let's begin with a prayer of awareness. And in these prayers that John Philip composes, he addresses them to his soul, his own soul. Awake, O my soul, to the beauty of the divine deep within you, and awake to its fragrance in the body of the earth. Know its strength of attraction and its grace to heal what has been torn apart. Awake, O my soul, to the beauty of the divine deep within you. We have noted in earlier conversations, and Newell emphasizes it quite a lot in this book, which I know a lot of you have read, Listening for the Heartbeat of God, and also already in this book, in the introduction, that is the honoring of women in Celtic tradition, that he says comes from their Druidic roots, their tribal culture. And one of the things that was just striking me this morning as I was going over, just scanning through the chapter again, is, in Scotland at least, tribal, that is to say clan membership is determined matriarchally, not patriarchally. It is the female line that establishes your clan. And I'm not sure about the details of how that works, but it strikes me that when a child is born, there is never any doubt about who the mother is. But there can be doubt about who the father is. Yeah. And I wonder if part of this honoring of the feminine is a very practical consideration for just genetic lines. Don't know, but it just struck me as a thing to wonder. Oh, I think I've been here. I have indeed. The Church of St. Bridget of Kildare. Oh, wow. Taken almost 3 years ago. Difficult to believe. In March, I think, of 19.
Well, there's a difference between matrilineal and matriarchal. Matriarchal would mean women are kind of in charge.
Yes.
Matrilineal is what you were saying, which is a genetic line. Sometimes they appear together in tribal groups, but
right.
Sometimes they're different.
Yeah. Masks are only functional if they cover your nose, So I hope we can be delivered from this sometime soon. But if we can cover our noses, let's do the thing. So, Celtic wisdom, John Philip says, remembers the sacredness of the feminine. Deep within us and deep within the matter of the universe is a conjoining of masculine and feminine energy. Thank you. Both are of God. Both are essential to us, individual and as a species. And a line that I really like, at the heart of the marriage of heaven and earth is a dance. When the sacred feminine and masculine move as one within us and make love, we are well. It is to that the stories and legends of Bridget of Kildare invite us to awaken. I want to talk a little bit before we get into the specifics of the book about how the Celtic world, and particularly the Celtic Christian world, communicates truth. And this might be a review for some of you. We tend to equate truth and fact. The Western philosophical, linear, logical mind doesn't make a big distinction between if something is factual, it's true. And if something is not factual, it is not true. And the best example of why that is a silly way to look at reality that I can think of is the story of Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve, some believe is factual, that it is literally true that somewhere around 4004 BC, perhaps somewhere in Mesopotamia, God took a chunk of mud and made a man, Adam. Most of us, I think, don't think that that is the case, that there is imagery in the story, and it wasn't remembered or told. Remember, the stories in that section of Genesis were campfire stories. They were told around, in the context of a gathered community. They're clearly intended to be spoken. The imagery in them is vivid, and the storyline is pretty basic, pretty simple. So they're easily remembered. But why are they remembered? They're remembered not because they happened once a long time ago. They are remembered because we recognize them. We recognize ourselves in the story. We know something about saying, "'Twarn't me, Lord, must have been that other person." We know something about being on the outs with one another because we have done something that wasn't kosher, was not allowed. I remember the first time I smoked a cigarette, and I knew that I was guilty as sin and that my mother would probably figure it out somehow. And so when we break rules, we know we are somehow alienated. That's what that story is about, and it's a universal experience. The story itself is so concise, so crisp, that almost any human being who is vaguely thoughtful can say, "Oh yeah, that story is true." And it doesn't have to be factual in order to be true. You've got to understand that basic rule of how to communicate in this whole study of Celtic lore, and particularly around Bridget. And there are other stories of saints from her time and in the following couple of centuries. But is that reasonably clear for people? Any difficulty with that? Because so.
I think it's called metaphor.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. That is one way of speaking of it. And it's essentially a poetic kind of imagery and wisdom.
Well, I think figurative language, I think, is something that gets missed, has been missed a lot by Western Christianity. Either it's misconstrued or taken as fact and not leading to something, a deeper truth. Mm-hmm. It's sad. But obviously the Gaelic people, they were nourished by figurative language.
Imagine how our way of thinking about the world would be different if Descartes, instead of saying, "I think, therefore I am," had said, "I feel, therefore I am."
Yeah.
It is a hugely different way of understanding your place in the universe. And I think that for the Celts, maybe "I feel, therefore I am," is a parallel truth. Probably the most beloved of Celtic saints is the golden-haired Bridget of Kildare, who lived 451 to 523. She had a pretty good long life. 72 was young by some standards these days. And she is the saint who loves the earth, who reveals the sacred of the feminine, who models female leadership, inspired poets and musicians, midwives as new beginnings, and extravagantly embodies compassion and boundless generosity towards the poor who went to her to seek refuge. Countless stories. One of my favorite stories of St. Bridget, I don't think he talks about in this particular chapter, is that she was the midwife for Mary in Bethlehem.
Yeah, it's mentioned.
It is meant, okay, it is tangential.
Hebridean, I mean, it's Hebridean. Isn't that kind of a Hebridean story? That she was the midwife because she was a tavern maid when they came
Yes,
to
he does talk about that, yes. But so the whole idea of time travel seems a bit silly to us, and we know that that could not possibly be factual. But I think you're right, he does make, he does say that she was, in truth, a midwife to the faith for the people of Ireland. She enabled in the culture a rebirth of Christ, of Christian awareness and of faith. So the image of her being a midwife to Christ is simply transposed to the story of Bethlehem. It's true. So there you go. For those of you who have read it and have had a chance to read the book, do please offer your own insights, wisdoms, thoughts, questions, puzzlements. Oh yeah, according to legend, Bridget was the midwife. I even had it highlighted. So the rest of you, does anything from this chapter jump out that you'd like to hold up and discuss?
One thing that struck me is that, and Newell says somewhere that she is the bridge between the transcendence of a Roman Christianity and the eminence of the Druidic tradition. She is a threshold. She is birth of those two together very beautifully. One of the other things I liked about it is that she was born apparently in a doorway or a threshold, between light and darkness. And so there's that, I guess we'd call the liminality between the upper lights and the darker lights. And she bridges that. And I was reading there also that many of the Irish people, when they gave birth, would sit in the threshold because they could push, I guess, against it in order to push the baby down. And so that threshold, I guess you'd say, symbology is very strong in this poetry, their life and their culture.
So the invitation to us is what? I think we're invited to an awareness of being kind of on the edge. And I think to be a Christian these days requires to be kind of on the edge of culture itself. Not to be totally subsumed by it, to be somewhat over against it, especially these days. And I think that you could have said, especially these days, at any point in history. We are in the world, but not of it, is a phrase. So the stories, multiple, of Bridget are told in those terms of being a threshold person on the edge between paganism, the Druidic tradition of her parents, and Christianity, the faith to which she was a convert. And does that image of being kind of on the edge hold experiential truth for any of you?
I think now, yes, like you said, now it is more difficult. People don't want to express outwardly so much their faith. You know, like you see things on Facebook or whatever, and oftentimes, you know, I say, well, I agree with that, I like that, but I'm not gonna, you know, say amen to everything that comes along, you know. And the evangelist ideas, you know, we look at the evangelist as a whole different kind of person than us. You know, we are withdrawn and inward with our religion and our feelings, as opposed to being more outward and expressive of that. So yeah, I think it is a living on the edge. Yeah, I believe it, but do I say it? Do I profess it?
Anybody else have a sense of edginess?
Well, I have a strong sense of it, and it pulls me a lot because I live in, you know, this culture here where I strive to get a profession and making money and that kind of thing, but I always felt a tide against all that. Like I never wanted to own a home unless I was married or something, had a bunch of children, because I felt like it was too big for one person. And I would be using a lot of resources, you know, or I guess you say my footprint, environmental footprint or whatever, carbon footprint would be large. It's a conscious choice I've made, but yet I feel edgy about it. Because most people I know have homes. And I do have homes, I love them. But I had one chance at opportunity to buy a townhouse in Columbia. I spent the money on flying lessons. Which I did, and I had a wreck, so I never went on. But I mean, in terms of the natural world, I am in that all the time. So when I talk to most people, it's not in the conversation. And I don't want to like introduce it like maybe I know more than you know or something like that, you know, just like, but it's edgy. It's a good word, and for me, and I live in that all the time. I kind of celebrate it in a way, but because I do outdoor education and stuff like that, but write nature story, nature poetry, and that thing, but whatever. It pulls me a lot.
One of the things that's noted in the book, a painting in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, called St. Bride, that is her name, by the Scottish artist John Duncan, 1866-1945, depicts Bridget being carried by the angels from Iona to Palestine to the birth of the Christ child. Now, Kildare is right here. Iona is up there. This is Iona and Lindisfarne, which we'll get to another time. But was Bridget ever in Iona? She actually predated, in her own life, the significance of Iona as a center of learning by about 150 years or so. So she probably was never in Iona. But why in the 19th or early 20th century would an artist have depicted her as ascending from Iona to go to Palestine, to go to Bethlehem? Why would he have done that? I think to associate her with that great tradition.
Right.
To associate her with the tradition that is really preserved and amplified and given a base for expansion in this crazy little island off the west coast of Scotland. Yes, Lynn.
Somewhere I read that her personage or her story was carried to England and Scotland and, by priests or by monks who told her story, and that there are quite a few, especially in Scotland and Wales, I guess, churches that are actually named St. Bridget.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So her essence was clearly taken across the waters and
Yes.
used to inspire people.
One of the things I like about the way Newell describes the whole tradition in this book is to make it clear that none of the people who were routinely rejected by mainstream imperial Christianity, that they lived within a tradition. They weren't one-off weirdos. They were in a significant, ongoing, theological, pastoral, philosophical tradition. And that tradition was mostly oral, for most of its history was carried forward orally, just as was the Old Testament. The earlier sections of the Old Testament, we don't have anything from the Old Testament that was written down at least until the 9th century BC, and no manuscripts that date much more than from about 200 BC. They were copied, recopied, and when you copy something, you nearly always copy what is relevant for your own time, not what is just factual for historical sort of fact, but the idea of a non-revisionist history, I think, is absurd. You cannot do it, because you always write. Whoever is writing any given moment in history is writing from the perspective of that moment. And as hard as we might try to be factual, we are still selective in the facts that we amplify. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
And so any history is interpretive, just by virtue of being selective. You imagine you're a newspaper editor. The newspaper editors sitting in the office of the New York Times have different stories to tell from editors sitting in whatever the tabloids are, the Daily Inquirer or whatever it is. They select differently, and so they tell a different story and give a different picture, different impression of what matters, what is in the forefront of people's minds. Okay. So we know how these are. Yes.
I love the idea of light, which is associated with Bridget, bringing the light into the world, or bringing, as a metaphor, Christianity into the world. But the fire, the perpetual fire, and it saddens me to think that when England invaded in Cromwellian Protestantism, they put out a fire that had been there for hundreds of years. But beyond that, I love the story of the eldest woman in the home always setting the fire in such a way at night that the embers would remain and still be there in the morning. And when she woke up, the first thing she did was to start that fire back up. So there's a perpetualness in that light in their home, which is acting out the Christianity that they embraced through Bridget, of the light.
Barb and I have several wood-burning fireplaces, and two that we use, and one in a living room, one in a dining room. And I can be utterly transfixed looking at the flames of a wood-burning fire. The gas fire doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't lick and change and shift the way a wood-burning fire does. there is something that I think has been seen for millennia. There's something sacred, something holy, something magical about the way fire licks.
The popularity of fire pits.
It's popular.
Popularity of fire pits.
Yeah, right.
Everybody has a fire pit.
You know, I think that once thought, I wrote an essay actually that I lost, that this obsession with looking at bright screens, like the monitors and computers or on your cell phone or whatever, is a substitute for for being around the brightness of a campfire.
Mhm.
You know, we've lost that, so it's addictive and it's horrible, and it's artifice, but there's something about that brightness or that luminosity or whatever, that the campfire is a little bit, not quite as bright as a computer screen, but it can get bright. And when I go camping, we usually, you know, go to bed, and I wake up in the morning, or my friend wakes up in the morning, and we go and stir those coals around to try to get a little flame going, because it's cold, you know, and it gets going. And last time we were there, you couldn't get it going, so you put a little bit of coal and fuel on it. But I mean, it's that idea of stirring it in the morning. I can see what you're talking about, Ray, in getting that flame going in the morning, you know, to warm you.
Another thing that Bridget models well is that her community, one, it had both men and women, monks and nuns, and also that it was not cloistered. It wasn't withdrawn from the world, but in the middle of an otherwise dynamic community of artisans and farmers and the like, craftspeople. It was a village. And the faith of the monastic, in monasticism, was simply an extension and sort of putting a magnifying glass on the faith that was that of the community. Contrast that with what we think of these days as being a monastery or a convent. Somewhat withdrawn. I was taught by nuns in high school, and they were not totally withdrawn, but they still wore funny clothes back in those days. And we were all quite convinced they didn't actually have feet, they had just little trundling wheels. And what this tradition, and what I hope we will increasingly take into our own souls, is the idea that there is not that separation. That what we do on Sunday is simply a way of focusing what we do all the rest of the time. What we do at the altar and receiving bread and wine, every time we eat a muffin, take a bowl of cereal in the morning, it is a communion of some kind. Everything that we do is sacred. And I think I'm particularly aware of that when I used to hunt. I would, with gun in hand, bless the woods as I walked into them, sort of asking for clean kills and things that I now look back on as kind of macabre, but there is a holiness in anything that we eat, anything that we receive as gift, anything that, and I'm now trying to talk myself out of making a case for vegetarianism, but I think an awareness of the holiness of everything is at the core that will make us ever more grateful. And my hope for myself is that even in bad times, I hope I never lose a sense of gratitude for all that there is.
And we can't forget that Bridget's vision of heaven was a lake of beer. So it continues on, this communion and using what is common to the people and celebratory it's a wonderful image.
Mhm.
Does it have some humor in it?
Mhm.
I hope so.
It's also her association with water, you know, the beginning of life and from the land and the water, and that source of life and water itself. And when I was in Ireland, you know, my focus mostly was on the thin places, the I mean, 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, kinds of spots. But the number of wells for Bridget, dedicated to Bridget, that we stopped and visited, were just, I mean, everywhere. And most of them were, you know, old wells, and you had to go down, you know, into like a cave-like experience. And I was struck by all of the tokens that were left at the wells in her honor, you know, from brides and mothers and prayers of just people who were visiting that well. They were just layer upon layer upon layer of years worth of collections of tokens
Mhm.
left in her honor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are lots of stories of other Celtic saints that amplify, point to the holiness of all things. Stories of St. Cuthbert, who was lived in Lindisfarne for a while in the 6th century, 7th century. Stories of his piety. He would wade out into the waves of the North Sea, and it never gets warm on this section of the North Sea. And he would wade out into the ocean and pray. He would recite the Psalter with his arms in cruciform, and he would then walk back onto the shore, freezing cold. And there's the story of how 2 otters accompanied him as he walked out of the water, and they shook themselves dry and then nuzzled themselves against his feet and legs to warm him. You know, we can Disneyfy pictures like that, make it just cute, but it's the point is the essential unity of humanity in nature. Humanity in nature, that there is no division, but core and same stories. St. Kevin, who was down here, in Glendalough, stories of how when he was translating, he was losing his sight, and he would be writing in a text, and a fly lit on the book he was copying to keep his place, and the fly would walk along the original text so that Kevin could follow it. Did it happen? Doesn't matter. It does not matter. The point that they're making is that essential cooperation of us with the rest of nature. Let's see. What druid simply means oak knower or bearer of oak wisdom. What we know about the Druids primarily comes from Julius Caesar, who just thought they were primitive people to be conquered. And so drove them out. This area in Wales, which did have Roman occupation, was a Druidic area. You'll note that the areas that are predominantly, that kind of survived and were not part of the Roman Empire, or less influenced by it, and who remained Celtic, are mountainous. Wales, this section of Cornwall, and obviously north up here. And this obviously not as mountainous, but separated by the Irish Sea. And this, by the way, is as far as Marcus Aurelius got. right there, looking across that narrow channel, and decided, nah, not going there. So, okay. What else do we want to look at here? I think yes. This is the prayer that Barbara just alluded to. I should like a great lake of ale for the King of Kings. I should like the angels of heaven to be drinking it through time eternal. I should like cheerfulness to be in their drinking. I would like Jesus to be there among them. I should like the three Marys of illustrious renown to be with us. I should like the people of heaven, the poor, to be gathered around from all parts. This lake of ale. I think that's a good image. Yes.
There's a bunch of thresholds in there, and anyway, that before that I wrote down here, and may recap some of this, is the threshold. One of them is a doorway between Christian and pre-Christian, which Bridget, is the threshold. Portal between the divine and the human, which she represents. The portal, the relationship between humanity and the earth, that threshold. And another one I wrote was the liminal space between the womb and the universe and what is trying to come into being.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of I wrote 4 of those down, but I was impressed by that.
Mm-hmm.
That Bridget, you see, represents those different thresholds. I was looking at the dawn this morning from my window and remember reading in there that Steve was bridging the lesser light of the moon and the upper light of the morning dawn. She was born at that time. And I was looking at the rosy I was thinking about Bridget being born,
I had an association again this morning as I was going over this, because over the last couple of nights the moon has been absolutely gorgeous. It's full just 2 nights ago, I think, and it shines brightly in our bedroom. And St. Francis, beloved St. Francis, I think has got a Celtic heart in many ways, and it struck me. He did not speak of Father, Son, and Mother Moon. He spoke of Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon. And that's a different understanding of our connection to nature. There's a kind of egalitarian understanding in brother and sister rather than an authoritarian one in father and mother, particularly in father, of course. I don't know why he said that. But, so.
I was happy to see that Bridget used the term anamkara, which is soul friend, same as Pelagius. And it seems to go way back and is a thread of having a soul friend, someone you can share your deepest quirkiness and laughter and sinfulness and goodness with. It's an important thing to add to your life. And I think because it goes way back, it sounds like one of those wonderful things that came from Old Testament times and just kind of worked its way through.
There is a wisdom in the mere fact of intimacy. It always strikes me that the people who probably love me the best are also the people who know me the best. And there's something really reassuring about being loved, even when people know you. I don't know about you, but I carry a lot of insecurity around in my belly about the worthiness of being loved and admired and respected and all the crap that we kind of want in our lives but don't deserve. So, well, let's go on. What questions are being kicked up? Anything being noted?
I just know that for me, like I'm up to chapter 9, so I'm almost done, that she's my favorite.
Mhm.
When I read everything, she's there.
Good.
One question I have is.
Soul friend.
This Bridget Pelagia's type of wisdom, it seems to me is a saving idea for our modern world. I mean, we are so disconnected with nature, we destroy it so badly. I mean, having this kind of consciousness completely changes things around in terms of how we regard the natural world and the earth and even each other in terms of equal relationships. And it's wonderful that you're teaching this, Martin, because introducing it to us, because I think it is a wisdom. Unfortunately, maybe it'll die, but it's a wisdom that could save the earth. You know? I mean, Native Americans, the same thing.
Right.
I'm with Native American stuff, but I mean, I didn't even know about this European tradition that was there for thousands of years until you told us about it.
Tribal cultures tend to be more earth-aware.
Yeah.
And remember, pagan simply means of the earth. Does not mean satanic or demonic. All right, let's see.
I loved my visit to Ireland because the people are, they're so special, you know, in so many ways, that they are able to believe without question. It's part of their being, their souls, that they believe in the fairies. Our bus driver would not do certain things or go certain places because the fairies would come back to haunt him for some reason or another, you know. I mean, it's just accepted. I mean, that's just the way it is. You don't question it. You know, you grow up with it. That love of the earth, the love and the respect for nature, their traditions that are such a mixture of the Druid and the Christianity. It's just such a delightful experience.
And perfectly ordinary, sensible-seeming people will talk matter-of-factly about the little people and fairies.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were in Sligo, which is one of my favorite cities, right there,
Yeah.
we were looking up at Barbara and I were planning to go to the mountain right outside of Knocknarea, right outside of Sligo, and I was buying a cap. I was in a men's haberdashery, and I wanted to get a tweed cap. And somehow the guy who was dressed in a suit and very, very old-fashioned staid, telling me my hat looked wonderful. I told him where we were going. He said, "Well, be careful. You know, the little people might be practicing tricks on you when you go up the mountain." And he was quite serious.
Absolutely.
And it was nothing kind of just fairy tale-ish. It was matter of fact. And there is a charm to that. I don't know how it functions intellectually, but I think, well, yeah, I think maybe it does. It acknowledges a kind of reverence for all that there is, all that's there, and that there are spirits that we don't see that are still functioning real spirits, real things. So,
You know, it made me think, you know, there is not a scientist who has ever seen a quark.
right.
But they believe they exist.
Yes.
You know, and I think we could say the same thing about the Irish belief in the little people.
Mhm.
You know, we haven't seen them, but we believe they exist.
Who else would lose the keys?
Yeah. They're a scapegoat.
Well, the fairies and the leprechauns and all that are of the earth.
Yeah.
And so, one thing in there I think is a reminder, do not take it for granted. Do not take the earth for granted. You know, because if you do, then we lose it. So the stories are so wonderful, the fairies and leprechauns, because they're of the earth, they're sprites in the woods, and, you know, and it just connects people to the, I don't want to hurt creation, my God, I might kill a fairy, or, you know, like,
Yeah. And I think that the tradition of hanging your prayers on the trees and, you know, they're, again, very obvious in their spirituality.
That's also a Hindu practice. Yes.
I love the fact that our bus driver for our trip in Ireland, when we got closer to Kildare, wanted to purchase a straw cross, the Bridget's cross.
Yeah, we made this, yeah.
And he asked Martin if he would bless it,
Yeah.
because he puts one in his house every year.
Yeah.
So that's another outward
Right.
manifestation of your
We-
faith
yeah.
in.
We had one on our bus that the bus driver kept there all the time, yeah.
If, picking up on what Lynn was saying, we had the most magnificent bus driver for a couple of weeks. And he was a practicing Roman Catholic. But we, on the bus, we all had prayers on the bus as we were driving to a site to go see, and we celebrated Eucharist several times, and we played music together, and he started playing music with us in the evenings. And our final day was actually in Kildare, and we were celebrating Eucharist in St. Bridget's Cathedral. And that was the first time he decided to receive communion with us. And it was really very touching. He was brought into the sense of, yes, the St. Bridget's cross. My pass this around?
Yeah, I think Lynn started, yeah.
That's the St. Bridget's cross. It's time, we've got to close. I want to finish with just reading a section that I think sums up a lot of what I take from this chapter. About the teat of Mary, the teat of Bridget, the teat of Michael, the teat of God, the nourishment of being in connection. You will not find such words in the traditional prayer books of Western Christianity. Teats are entirely lacking there, whether creaturely, human, or divine. We need to learn to laugh at this almost unbelievable disconnect between the spiritual and the physical, and between the feminine and the divine. If we do not laugh, let us weep, for it is a tragic separation between the realms of grace and nature, a lack of integration that has wreaked havoc in the lives of so many women and men and in humanity's relationship to the earth. But maybe we need to do both, to laugh and weep, for both will help release in us holy tears to water the soil of our souls and nurture again our memory of nature's sacredness and the sacredness of the feminine. God be with you.
As they say, peace.
May the spirit of St. Bridget guide your days and thoughts.
The road rise to meet you.